Alright, so what we have here are the models that you see on the website. And the first model is the one pertaining to the Luchot, the two tablets, which are said to be 6 handbreadths by 6 handbreadths by 3 handbreadths. And the number of elements, of course, is 6 times 6 is 36, times 3 is 108. So we will have 108 elements in the matrix. And there are, of course, 2 Luchot. So a total of 216 elements, which correspond to the number of letters in the name. Now, if you put them like this, we have 6 by 12, which is 72, times 3 in the third dimension, which is a slightly more accurate reflection of the nature of the mathematics, the geometric characteristics of the name. Now, what we have here is a model of a star tetrahedron. In fact, both of these are star tetrahedrons. And this is solid. The first thing you'll notice is that we have, first of all, we have a male tetrahedron and a female tetrahedron. Really a representation of opposites. We live in a male-female universe in the sense that there's good and evil, there's up and down, heaven and earth, judgment, mercy. You have the quintessential twins, the righteous man, Yaakov, and the evil twin, if you will, in Esav. The thing to note about this is that when one tetrahedron subdivides another tetrahedron, it divides it into 5 specific polyhedrons. That's 5 polyhedrons for each of the original tetrahedrons. And any given face is divided like so. This, by the way, this particular face is one of the more common transforms in fractal geometry, the Koch 3D transform. And in this particular case, each of the 24 small faces is further divided like the parent, so that you can see the 72 triangular corners. A triangle, of course, being a triplet. 3, you have, just like this model corresponds to the 3 times 72, or the 72 triplets. You also have this one corresponding to the 72 triplets. So the question is, of course, what are we seeing here? And in essence, what we're seeing is a geometric reflection of the mathematic characteristics of the explicit name. Now, there's a reason for that, which we're going to go into in the book. Meantime, we also have this model over here, which is simply a stick version of the tetrahedron that you can see through. It's missing the base of the stellation, but that's okay because we're going to use this for just a framework to demonstrate how the events that actually happen down below here on Earth correspond to a larger reality. And so that's where we're going to begin. We'll start with the plagues. Now, plagues were very, very interesting. They had a certain pattern to them. The first plague, of course, was the plague of blood. And in the case of the plague of blood, Moses went to Paro to warn him of the, you can see I've got it drawn in threes here, because the first plague, Moses went to Paro outside the palace by the river to warn him of this particular plague. And in the next plague, the second plague, which was frogs, he went to him inside the palace. And in the third plague, which is the plague of lice, there was no warning at all. So we're going to go ahead and put this onto the star tetrahedron and begin to assemble a two-dimensional representation of these plagues. Now, in the second set of plagues, we have an identical pattern. In this particular set of plagues, the fourth plague was wild animals, wild creatures. And Moses went to Paro again at the river to warn him outside the palace. And then, of course, the fifth plague was, the warning was again given inside the palace, and this was for the epidemic. And finally, the sixth plague, there was at all given for the plague of boils. And we'll go ahead and put this over here on the model. Now, at this particular point, the Maharal, I want to mention that the Maharal talked about these patterns. He found them very significant. And naturally so, because even Pharaoh started recognizing a pattern at this point. He knew that the next time Moses was going to come to him, it was going to be outside the palace at the river. He decided to change his schedule, and he went to a completely unknown location, a secret place, and of course, who was there waiting for him but Moshe. And in the case of the seventh plague, the warning was given outside the palace at this other location, and it was pertaining to hail. And then the next plague was inside, the warning was given inside, and that was for the locusts. And then finally, the 9th plague, there was no warning given at all, and that was for the plague of darkness. So we've basically got 3 sets of 3 plagues here, forming a pattern that define the edges and borders of basically a star tetrahedron, but in the 2-dimensional sense. Now, in the text pertaining to the 9th plague, it mentions that they lasted for 3 days. The number 3 is mentioned twice in succession, alluding to the 3 times 3 that we see here in this 2-dimensional orthographic projection. Well, that leaves 1 plague. Now, before we get into that 1 plague, we should mention that each of these plagues individually conform to one of 3 different aspects. It was either outside the palace, inside the palace, or no warning was given at all. And similarly, when we get into the 10th plague, while it's only 1 plague, there were 3 aspects to the 10th plague. The first aspect was that the death of the firstborn would pertain to Paro. And then the second was that the death of the firstborn would pertain to firstborn of the slave girl. And the third is the firstborn of the animals. And so we'll complete our geometry here. And you can see how the characteristics of these plagues conform to the edges, borders, and faces of a star tetrahedron, whether it's in flattened 2-dimensional framework or whether it's in the 3-dimensional framework. And we can also represent this 3-dimensionally simply by changing our models here. And I'm going to do that right now. And we'll put on the 3-dimensional versions. The first plague was outside the plague of blood. In this particular case, the next one, you see how we have it on each of the 3 sides now. So we're representing it 3-dimensionally, but we get the same result. So now we have it in 3 dimensions. Now, maybe this is all a coincidence. Let's just see how far this particular rabbit hole goes. These plagues we read about in the Triad Havaya and Bo. Now what we're going to do is we're actually going to flip this around. I'll have to take these off because they're going to fall off anyway. We'll flip this upside down, just for sake of argument. We're going to start with the 2-dimensional considerations. Now, there were 3 million Israelites in Egypt, and we're going to see how this conforms in a moment. Because there were 3 million Israelites, Paro thought, of course, that he was going to have to contend with 3 million at the sea. So the sages of Israel said, well, he sent 3 soldiers for every Israelite. So if there were 3 million Israelites, he sent 9 million soldiers to deal with those 3 million Israelites. So you can see how in the 2nd dimension, the ratio, the sets of numbers and the ratio between those sets connects with one another. Now let's talk about a tetrahedron just briefly. This tetrahedron is defined by 6 edges. You have the 1, 2, 3 edges in the 3rd dimension, and you have the 1, 2, 3 edges in the 2nd dimension. That's 6 edges, as you can see. So let's put that in our 3rd dimension here. Leading the charge of those 9 million soldiers, in order to get there very, very quickly, Paro sent 600 chariots. There we go. Now, as is known from our many sources, each of these soldiers, in fact all of the soldiers, were armed with, well, let's start with the chariots. Normally there were 2 horses attached to each chariot, but because Paro was in a hurry to catch up with Israel, they attached 3 horses to every chariot. Now, not only did they attach 3 horses to every chariot, but they armed each of the soldiers with 3 different types of weapons. Now, I'm going to represent this in 3 dimensions. I could do it in 2 dimensions as well, but you'll get the idea. So there were 3 horses for each chariot. Each of the soldiers had 3 weapons. And amongst the soldiers, there was 3 opinions as to exactly what they should do with the Israelites when they caught up to them. Now, we'll start to populate our model in the 3rd dimension, and you can see that, of course, that's 1 horse, 1 opinion, and 1 weapon, but there were 3 in each case, so we're going to, now we've got 2 built into the model. And over here, we'll put on this side, we'll put our 3rd set of horses, weapons, and opinions. So you can see how, again, the events correspond to the events below seem to correspond to a larger reality. Now, we talked about how each tetrahedron represents basically opposites. And this top tetrahedron does not really represent Egypt. It represents Israel, as you can see from the 3 million that were at the sea in the second dimension. So let's put these chariots where they belong here. On the bottom of the same tetrahedron. We have our 600 chariots. We have our 9 million soldiers. We have the 3 horses and the 3 opinions and the 3 weapons. And who opposed them at the Red Sea? Well, it was God, really, with Israel. And we mentioned before that when we read in Parsha Beshalach, we have our 3 verses with 72 letters, which is basically our confirmation that the divine presence was there at the sea. We have 3 verses, and each verse has 72 letters. And that's on the opposing tetrahedron. So, once again, you can see that the events down below define the edges and borders of a set of mathematical constructs that define this particular geometry. And what does this represent? This represents, it's a geometric reflection of the mathematic characters of the letters of God's name. The purpose of all this isn't to extol the virtues of star tetrahedrons or polyhedrons or anything of that sort. It's to demonstrate that our existence is really, in a sense, a metaphor for the letters of God's explicit name.